dark, wet alley was slightly illuminated by Sarah's cell phone light as she shined it every few seconds to see where she was headed. Her eyes scanned the darkness, and she shook crazily. What had happened to her last night was a mystery. She thought back to the bar. She had just come in with her friends, just a fun night out. Nothing could have happened, or so she thought. Now she was trembling, walking from building to building at 3 a.m. Again she thought back, but everything was a blur. She passed an old ratty motel and a pub. Sarah made her way to the outskirts of her neighborhood, around a heavily wooded area. She walked. She clenched her eyes shut tight for moments at a time. She was huddled into her coat for warmth as the cold rain covered her for what seemed like an eternity. Just as her eyelids took cover of her eyes, something shined out of the corner of her vision. She instantaneously flashed her eyes open once again, and her pupils became wide. She looked around. Nothing stood out in the blackness and the rain. She spun around and continued her way back, hoping that she would make it home. As she studied her surroundings, she remembered a shortcut that she took as a kid when playing hide and seek with her childhood playmates. It involved climbing through the woods. The cold woman hesitated, but came to the decision that anything that would get her to her warm home quicker is the better way. Sarah headed towards the forest, and as she made her way in, the first tree that she laid eyes on had been marked. What was marked on the tree mystified her. What looked like a circle, with an X inside. She knew nothing of its origin or meaning. She just assumed that it was some kind of gang symbol or something of the sort. Making her way into the forest, she recalled the fun times that she had as a kid. She thought to herself out loud, I miss those times, back when the world wasn't such a... Her voice trailed off. Sarah heard the loud crack of a tree branch off in the distance behind her. Terrified, she began running through the woods, and she soon became lost. She continued on anyway, hoping to find a way out. Her lack of caution quickly resulted in her leg being caught on a nearby lying root. As she fell to the ground, attempting to get up caused her even more pain. She had twisted her ankle. Somebody help me! She cried out. The crunching of leaves became present again. She attempted to stand up and run once again, but her injury kept her in one place. She clenched her eyes shut out of fear. And as she opened them again, a tall, white man dressed in a suit stood before her. She had become visually impaired at the sight of this man. She began screaming in terror, but was soon silenced by the slender, pale man that stood before her in the dark. 4 o'clock. What once was a young boy now was a cold-blooded psychopath. Jeff the Killer had finished what he called his daily rounds. The slaughtering of innocent people, this was almost all that flooded Jeff's mind. He dragged his feet up from the wet cement as he entered what he called his home for years. Jeff stepped foot into a world of tragic memories. Clutching 2 whiskey bottles in hand, Jeff had become a drunken killing machine. His brain was filled with the scent of murder. One thought that did cross his psychotic mind had been that since day one, as the rain hit the weary house, Jeff began to recall the night in which he slaughtered his entire family. He chuckled at the thought. If it wasn't for his insanity, he might have thought about regret, remorse for taking the lives of the people that he once loved, but that wasn't possible at this point. Jeff was out for one thing, and one thing only. Death. 5 o'clock in the morning. He took another swig at his alcohol. What the fuck am I sitting here for? What the fuck am I sitting here for? As he got up to make his way into the night, he swerved a bit and took another chug at his whiskey. The alcohol hit his warm, bloody lips, and he felt an odd sensation. A sudden urge had hit him. He stood in the room, gazing out at the forest beyond the house. Jeff checked his pockets. Cigarettes, a lighter, and of course, his knife. Jeff knew that something wasn't right. The feeling that he got was a mix of the urge to kill again, and something far different than what he had ever felt before. He stormed out of his home, into the cold, wet night. Jeff was now in a dark street, his only light source being a lamp illuminating the road. The rain, still pouring, hit Jeff's back. He started to move in the direction of the forest. He struggled a bit. His alcohol consumption that night had been extremely high, and the killer approached the desolate forest. Before he entered, he took a quick glare to his left. Jeff was not far from a cemetery. He trembled towards it. A thought blew into his mind, almost like the wind on a breezy afternoon. The last piece of his family was only feet away, and it beckoned him. He moved his feet away from the forest and towards the graveyard. Slowly, Jeff walked, yet he tripped a few times, spanning the short distance. He approached a grave, and Jeff graced it with a rotten odor of death. His jacket being covered in the blood and remains of his victims, Jeff simply gazed at the cold slab of granite. His vision was too distorted to make out any sort of word. Because of this, he just stood and stared. Jeff's insides began to feel uneasy, and his throat became dry. The same feeling from moments before. Jeff stumbled back to the forest. While trembling towards the woodland, his eyes wandered to a tree a few feet farther out than the others. What looked like a small grayish piece of paper could be seen hanging by a nail. His eyes blurry, he was unable to read it. He took no attempt either, and crept into the darkness, slowly, almost as if he recognized this place, as if it were his true home. Squeezing his 2 whiskey bottles, he studied the forest in a drunken haze. Jeff admired the darkness. It reminded him of a black hallway, one where the murderer could easily slash the necks of his victims without being seen. As he continued walking, Jeff became, in a way, infatuated. The simple blackness swirled around him. Muttering to himself in unrecognizable gibberish, he continued to trot. Something felt a bit odd. The crunching of leaves seemed too loud to account for only one person. Jeff felt as if something was lurking beyond his line of sight. "Who's there?" Jeff growled. An abundance of noise could be heard, but nothing out of the ordinary. The chirps of crickets grew louder as Jeff studied his surroundings. "Come on, chicken. I don't really like games, and not hide and seek at all." As Jeff announced this, a quick rustling from a nearby bush could be heard. He slashed at it before the sound could come to a silence on its own. Jeff then saw what was hidden out of sight the entire time. "Damn rats. Just some good-for-nothing pests," Jeff proclaimed as a rodent scurried from the leaves. After he had seen what was hidden in the bush, he continued his midnight stroll. The rain crashed against his back and came to a slow stop. His vision was becoming very blurry, and a loud noise was inside his head. What could be heard was a figment of Jeff's insane imagination, for the woods were completely silent. He tampered around, dragging his feet and cursing at the almost unbearable noise. Nothing like it had pierced his ears in such discontent before. The noise that drowned Jeff slowly became absent. From the pain, Jeff fell to a tree. Both bottles that were once clenched in his hands fell towards the ground. One crashed against the bark and shattered everywhere. The crack of glass had viciously dragged Jeff back to consciousness, and his eyes readjusted to the darkness once more. The blurriness was magnified as Jeff saw a white, oval-like object hovering above him. His eyes quickly focused from shock. But what had been in front of him a few seconds ago was nowhere to be found. What the fuck was that? Jeff chuckled at his own remark. Was his mind playing tricks on him? Now I know that ain't no damn rats. He hastily came to the conclusion that something had been lurking in the darkness, following him from a distance. That's it. I'm done playing games. What the fuck are you? Bastard. Jeff screamed at the top of his lungs in hope of some kind of response. He was answered abruptly. As he started to walk again, he felt the slightest tingle on his neck. That's not the damn air, fucker. Get the hell out of the bushes before I decide to fuck you up. Jeff felt wild at this point. Nothing about this place was right, but he was enjoying every minute of it. Swiftly, he pulled his shining blade from his coat pocket and began slashing at the trees in the darkness. Come on, bitch! He screamed out. No hiding! I'll cut every last chip of bark from I'll cut every last chip of bark to slit your throat! Jeff pointed his knife towards a tall, thin tree protruding from the left of his vision. And stabbed it. He was astonished to see that, on direct contact, the tree, or what he thought was a tree, faded away into the darkness in a matter of milliseconds. Not knowing what to do, he glanced quickly towards his right and stabbed at the black of night. He peered out into the wood and saw not what he expected. What stood before the psychotic boy was an extremely tall, thin man, dressed in a clean black suit. This was all that Jeff could make out at the moment. The rain caused Jeff's sight to become immensely distorted. Jeff's eyes had cleared again, and he quickly began to observe the man. He was emaciated, his face pale, almost pure white in color. As Jeff studied the face, he soon came to notice the lack of facial features on this man. The thing's face was completely empty. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a white, blank head. This made Jeff feel a bit uneasy, and he soon broke out into a laugh. Although astounded, Jeff soon addressed the figure before him. So, you were the bastard chasing me through the woods, huh? Jeff stared at the blankness once more. You know, I don't know what the fuck you are, but you kind of remind me of myself. You've got a nice, white face, but all you're missing is a smile. Jeff began laughing uncontrollably at his own notion, yet he was stopped. Jeff's ears were assaulted by static, and he fell to the ground. He was shrouded in complete darkness as he clenched his ears for mercy. The figure Jeff earlier questioned was now causing Jeff extreme pain, while the place where his eyes should have been stared directly into Jeff. At that point, Jeff snapped. He broke free of the pain, drew his knife once more, and began slashing. Each one of his moves were futile, as the man moved around in no time at all, almost as if he was teleporting from place to place to avoid the attacks. The tall man began to fight back. Jeff had just now begun to notice the tendrils hanging from the back of his attack.